this morning. Yeah. Well, we are going to pick up right where we left off last week in Hosea chapter 6. Hosea chapter 6. And we're going to be picking up in verse 4. While y'all turn there, I'll go ahead and get started reading it. What am I going to do with you, Ephraim? What am I going to do with you, Judah? Your love is like the morning mist, like the early dew that vanishes. This is why I've used the prophets to cut them down. I have killed them with the words from my mouth. Now, this is a lament from God to the people. It's where we left off. We were talking about this, problem. This problem, this lack of love from the nations, right? It's compared here to the morning dew. It's here and then it's gone. Quick, it's easy. The moment the sun comes out, that morning dew evaporates, just like their love for the Lord. And that's kind of where we left off. And can I get somebody to read verse 6? So here, sorry, I'm catching up to PowerPoint. Here we are. So we saw the shift where we see God begin to discuss the sin and consequence of both nations. And verses 4 and 5 make it clear why. It's their fickle love. And verse 6 starts this discussion between verses 6 and 7. Why is it, or what is it God truly wants from the people? What does he say in verse 6? What is his true desire for the people? Faithfulness, knowledge of God, to love him. See, he even says, I didn't want burnt offering and sacrifice. I wanted your faithfulness, your love. The Old Testament law wasn't about taking the firstborn sheep of your flock and sacrificing it on an altar to appease God. It was about bringing yourself to God. The lamb is just what got you there. And God, even here in Hosea, is like, look, it was about you coming to me, caring about me, loving me. But you have a problem. Can I get somebody to read verse 7? So there's an interesting thing here. But like men, as the translation you have there, does anybody have anything else? Adam, it's the same word. But like Adam, they have violated the covenant. There they have betrayed me. I think we have a very intentional allusion to the beginning. What is the first covenant, especially since that's what Hosea focuses around, that we see in the biblical text? That is exactly it. God says, I'm putting you here in this garden, and there's one thing you can't do. You don't touch this one tree, and all of this is yours. This good creation that I have made, you can benefit from it as long as you don't do this one thing, man. That is the first covenant in the Bible. And in Hosea here references that because the people of Israel and Judah have the same problem as Adam, Eve in the garden. They sin. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. It's a reference to Adam, this first covenant violation. See, people haven't changed. We haven't changed. We can't think of ourselves as all that much better than Israel, Judah. We commit the same problems. because man has had the same fundamental problem literally since the beginning. From Genesis chapter 3 on, man has a problem called sin.
It's a form of selfishness. Adam, Eve, all of them, us today, we all want what we want, and those things sometimes are things in which we should not have. And, it's just human nature.
Yeah, no, human nature a lot of times is, you know what, God, I'm going to do it my way. I don't need you. You said X, I'd rather do Y. The problem hasn't changed. It just takes different shapes and forms. Because we always, and this is something we're going to talk about a little bit this morning, we always think we're so much more sophisticated and so much smarter than those ancient people with all their sin and idolatry and debauchery and all these problems. No, we're not. We just think we are. But the problem is still the same, sin. So, anything else on this before we jump into the next little chunk? Well, if not, can I get somebody... Oh, sorry, there's one other thing here. That last little line there they have betrayed me. There is a site in Judah called Adam. It's referenced in Joshua 3:16. That's like a potential maybe allusion here to that location as well. But there's just not much known about the location overall. They've done some digs and stuff, and they haven't really found evidence of any idolatry or anything. But it's a time where Judah and Israel are sinning like crazy, and that could very well have happened. Just one of my little nerdy points to throw in there. But can I get somebody to read verses 8 through 10?
Gilead is a city of evildoers and defiled with blood, as bands of robbers lie in wait for a man, so the company of priests murdered on the way to Shechem. Surely they commit lewdness. I have seen a horrible thing in the house of Israel. There is the harlotry of Ephraim. Israel is defiled.
So what is the sin that's God's outlining here? What's the problem? Yeah, priests are murdering everybody. Tracy.
I was just saying, there's robbers. I was seeing that.
It's theft and bloodshed and all these awful things. And there's one group, Miss Garrett said it, the priests are committing this. If there's one group that literally shouldn't do it, it's the guys that should be, dedicating themselves to God to teach others. But they're literally called a priesthood of murderers. And it gets worse, actually. The priests are brought up as these murderers on the way to Shechem, which is a priestly city and a refuge city. Numbers and Joshua have the references up there. Both talk about Shechem as these things. Do y'all remember what a refuge city is in the old law? Yeah, when manslaughter happens, these are certain cities selected that hey, you can avoid the punishment. You can kind of get out of it because you didn't mean it. You just got to get here first for protection. And these priests, it seems, are literally waiting on the highway there to kill them anyway, to murder them. And they're priests. The priesthood of Israel is literally a bunch of no good murderers. And they've even defiled the law to a point they can't even uphold the sanctuary cities that they were given. Anything on that before we move on? If not, can I get somebody to read chapter 6, verse 11 through 7, verse 2? So, we see the sin outlined all the more. All right? They practice fraud. They will be exposed. They break in, they're in raiding parties. They never consider that I remember. They're evil. They are right in front of my face. Chapter 6, verse 11 through 7, verse 2 show a time when all this sin, all this evil is going to be dealt with. And it's going to be exposed. Everyone's going to see it. And it's going to happen by God's very all-knowing nature. See, in the ancient world, they don't think of gods the same way we do a lot of the time. They think you can hide stuff from them a lot of the time. I mean, look at Greek and Roman mythology. People try to do things behind the god's back all the time, and a lot of times get away with it. And God's here saying, no. See, I'm not like them. I know what you're doing. It happens right here in front of my face. I know. I'm an all-knowing God, and your sin is ever before me. He's going to expose it because God knows all. Anything here? Well, if not, we get some interesting images coming up. And we're going to really talk about, well, the kingship of Israel. Because it's a mess, to say the least. So, can I get somebody to read verse 3 through 7 of chapter 7?
By their evil they make the king glad, and the princes by their treacheries. They are all adulterers, and are like a heated oven, whose vapor ceases to stir the fire, from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. On the day of our king, the princes became sick with the heat of wine. He stretched out his hand with mockers. For with hearts like an oven they approach their injury. All night their anger smolders, in the morning it blazes like a flaming fire. All of them are hot as an oven, and they devour their rulers. All their kings have fallen, and none of them calls to mind.
So, what is God saying here about the kings? Yeah, they're pleased by all this behavior. All right, this is what they want. That's the first problem. But what's the result of the problem? Yeah, you're pleased by all this behavior, king? Well, there will be no more kings. That's the first big thing. But how does God say it's going to happen? Yeah, they're going to be consumed. The very people who they are pleased with are going to burn them away like bread in an oven that's left too long. They're literally going to heat up treachery against themselves and be consumed by it. If you get to the back end of especially the book of Kings, and you look at the kings of Israel, they get killed one after another, after another, after another by the people closest to them. Because, well, without God, it's free game. These other idols, these other gods, like it when I do that. They actually want me to seize power. I sacrifice to them to get more power. And I take it. And because I don't have the God, I'll turn up treachery against myself. These kings will cook up treachery against themselves through their actions, and the heat of the treachery will consume them. Corey.
You know, Solomon said there's a way that seems right to man, but the end are the ways of death. Here they are, you know, they're totally ignoring God's will. They're totally ignoring everything He's told them. We're going to do it our way, and then they're not even looking, realizing the pit that they're putting themselves in. And not only that, though, they're going to fall into His hands, and He will get revenge on them. And, you know, again, we can fall in this same trap if we decide, you know, just become cold-hearted or whatever. But I mean, the good thing about having this book is we can look into Israel's past or Paul's, Peter's, whoever, and we can see the things that they're doing and try not to do the same things. But we still can fall in the trap.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that's the problem here for a lot of it is they're happy about it. Was that a hand up or? Yeah.
He says they're like a cake that is burned on one side and raw on the other. That would be a totally useless cake if it's fit for nothing but to be thrown away.
Mm-hmm.
But you allow it to burn on the bottom and not even get done on the top. They're very inconsistent in everything that they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're literally half baked. It is a useless image, isn't it? It is let's be honest. None of us wants to eat a piece of bread that is burnt on one end and not done on the other. How useless is that? And that's what the kingship of Israel has become. God does some very good imagery through his prophets. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about. Imagery. Really seeing the depth of these pictures. And the kings have become useless like half-baked bread. Anything else on this? Well, if not, verse 7. There's one thing that could have stopped all of this. All their kings fall, not one of them calls on me. It's a clear indication. If they had just turned back to me, if they had just called on me and not Baal, not all these other gods and idols and all this stuff, it could have been okay. It could have been avoided. That is the heartbreaking part about all of this. All the judgment, the punishment, the pain, the suffering throughout the entirety of the minor prophets. It could have been avoided if they had just known God. If they had chosen to know him. Because that's the big part of this. They had the decision to make. They had a choice. It's not like God said, you know what? Nah, you don't get to know me. Yeah, you stay over there, buddy. No, it was actually quite the opposite. That's the point. He's like, I want you to come know me. I want to know you. But you refuse. And because of that, well, your choices will bear their consequences. And, well, you'll all fall. And this brings us to verses 8 through 10. Can somebody read those for me?
Ephraim has mixed himself among the peoples. Ephraim has repaid his return. Eliam has devoured his strength, and he does not know it. He has gray hairs and beard, and they are on him, and he does not know it. Yet I will berate them to the last man. Man, yes, woe to them when I depart from them. Thank you for your patience.
Oh, you're all good.
Yeah.
8 through 10 here.
And the pride of Israel testifies to his face. They do not return to the Lord their God, nor seek him for all.
So we get a kind of a continuation of that bread image, right? It's like unturned bread, but it's also compared to like, this hair that's streaked with gray, but the person doesn't even notice. What's the picture? They don't even realize what's going on. They're paying that little attention. It's withering them away. It's cooking them away. And they don't even know that it's getting worse. Because here's my question. Once you start going gray, does it go the other direction again? Yeah. And once you put that burnt piece of bread and leave it in the oven, is it going to get better the longer it stays in there? No. No. It's going to get worse. And that's God's point. Over time, this is just growing all the worse. You're not ever helping the problem. Actually, you continually, make it worse. And all of it, all this corruption, this over time buildup and decay and withering could have been avoided. Just like the kings. Turn to God. Patrick.
It's still a problem today because James deals with it, right? And so in James chapter, what is it here? James chapter 1, beginning in verse 22, we're told, be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving ourselves, right? So that's always the problem, is self-deception, because I like what I like, but I like it the way I like it, right? And I never get away from myself. So I've got to be on guard against that. For anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in the mirror, for he looks at himself and goes away at once and forgets what he was like. So even when they can recognize it, even when I can recognize it, I can still ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of the danger that we are always in. And so we look at books like this to help us realize that this isn't just us looking down our noses at stupid old Israel back there 3,000 years ago or whatever it was. It's in our own backyard, in our living room, and whatever. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it goes right back to like what verse 7 said with Adam. The sin hasn't changed. How we play these things out hasn't changed. It's actually quite the same. We just think we're better. That's why we're here. That's why we're studying this. So we can see, hey, minor prophets apply to us too. Yeah, we may not be Israel. We may not be Judah. But we face the same problems. Anything else on, well, this over time degradation and corruption? Well, if not, we'll finish out this last little panel here. Can somebody read 11 through 12?
Ephraim is like a dove, surely and without sense, going to Egypt, going to Assyria. As they go, I will spread over them my net. I will bring them down like birds of the heavens. I will discipline them according to the report made to their congregation.
So what's the image here we see? Yeah, something that was referenced earlier, right? If you look back towards the back end of the book of Kings and stuff, what does Israel do? Yeah, they go to Syria and Egypt for help. Like, hey, we're losing power. We're falling apart over here. Can y'all help us? And God says, hey, you're going to them like a silly dove. I mean, that's how it's translated a lot of times. He literally calls them silly, senseless. He's like, and you're going to turn to them. You're going to run to them. I'm going to cast a net. I'm going to cast a net out in that sky, and you're coming down. They're not going to save you. You're not even going to get there. You're going down, and I'm going to be the one to do it. I referenced it back towards the beginning of our study, but if you historically look at the fall of Israel, the northern kingdom, it happened. That was an awful snap yet again. But it happened so fast, it's ridiculous. I mean, on the historical world stage, Israel falls in what we would consider overnight. They degrade and just crumble, historically speaking. And God says, I'm going to do it. I'm going to cause it. The root cause is you don't know me, and you were supposed to. Therefore, I will let you reap this consequences. You will fall.
And I'm sure their secular leaders thought it was wisdom. Hey, let's get a deal with Egypt and Assyria. Let's create a bond. Let's create an alliance that would make us strong. And so politically speaking, at the time, they did what they thought was smart and prudent.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, definitely. Like, yeah, that's actually a very good point, Tracy. Because if you look at Syria, historically speaking, they hit this odd point where they kind of really go downhill themselves. But then at almost that same time where Israel starts to really fall apart, Assyria does the exact opposite. Assyria rises up to be the world power of the day. It's not until Babylon comes along that they fall. And, well, I mean, yeah, in the political sense, it's probably smart to go to Assyria. They're the big bad boys at the time. They're taking over people left and right. Better get on their good side. And it doesn't quite work out for Israel.
People are writing the Bible, I do, some people like to write the Bible. In Second Kings 17, starting in verse 13, it says, "Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and every seer, saying, Turn from your evil ways, and keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded you, which I commanded your father, and which I sent to you through my servants the prophets. However, they did not listen, but stiffened their necks like their fathers, who did not believe in the Lord their God, and they rejected his statutes and his covenants, which he had made with their fathers, and his warnings, which he had warned them. And they followed vanity, and became vain, and went after the nations which surrounded them, concerning which the Lord commanded that they not be like them. And then you skip down to verse 18, it says, So the Lord was angry with Israel, and removed them from his sight. None was left except for the tribe of Judah.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty well summarizes all that he's saying here in Isaiah.
Mm.
He warned them again and again, it was not to quit. He was not trying to bring them back. They were absolutely refusing to.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good thing to actually bring up is like, he does warn them again and again and again. I kind of wish I had dropped this in here now. But historically speaking, like when Hosea takes place is actually the last prophet to Israel. He's not the first of the minor prophets even. This is the last guy. Hosea is the, lifeline God's throwing. Like, hey, I've warned you and I've warned you and I've warned you. You gotta come back. Because look what's coming. Jeff.
We used to call people bird brain.
That's, yeah, bird brain. Yeah, that's pretty much what God calls Israel here, bird brains. You're a silly dove that I'm going to catch in the net. And Jeff, I love you. Okay. It doesn't look like my slides uploaded for this part, but we'll roll on. We're going to finish out chapter 7. Can I get somebody to read 13 through 16?
Woe to them, for they have strayed from my instruction, to them, for they have rebelled against me. I will redeem them, but they speak lies against me. They do not cry to me from their heart, but they wail upon their beds. For grain and wine they dash themselves, they rebel against me. Although I train and strengthen their arms, yet they devise evil against me. They return, but not upward. They are like a treacherous bow. Their princes shall fall on the sword because of the insolence of their tongue. They shall be their diversion in the land of Egypt.
Woe to them. Those are some important words here. We see these woe to statements in a few different places, like Isaiah chapter 3. And when this happens, it's typically something God says right before judgment. He's saying, woe to them for what's to come. Woe to them, for they will be destroyed. And here in Hosea, we have one of those statements. And we start to see God lament, God upset, because what's going to happen? Because of their choices. Woe to them, for they fled from me. Destruction to them, for they rebelled against me. And here's the heartbreaking part. This is why God's upset. Though I want to redeem them. And the Hebrew here is actually kind of interesting because there's two ways to translate it. I want to redeem them or I have redeemed them. Because you notice there's one thing that keeps coming up in this book over and over and over again. It's the Exodus. He did redeem them. He saved them from slavery. He saved them from the captivity and sin. And he wants to redeem them still. It's heartbreaking because they fled and rebelled from him. And woe to them. And you see what they're doing as this is fleeing. They do not cry out for me from their hearts. Rather, they wail on beds and slash themselves for grain and new wine. It's idolatrous practice. See, in the ancient world, there was these things called blood sacrifices. They're referenced in the old law. And part of that is cutting yourself open and draining blood out for this God to consume. And God's saying even here, he's like, you're doing that. These are things I have explicitly said not to do. These are things in the old law that is very clear. Don't do this. He's like, you've even fallen into that. I trained and I strengthened you. And you've plotted against me. They've actively done this, right? He built them up. He made them a nation. He gave them the land of promise. And they actively plotted against him. This was intentional. They turn, but not to what's above. They're like a faulty bow. They don't aim for what's true. They're broken. Their leaders will fall by the sword because of their insolent tongue. They speak out against God. They will be ridiculed for this in the land of Egypt. That Egypt image, especially as we get into chapter 8, something to keep track of. Because Egypt's in the background of all this. The story of him redeeming them the first time is at the forefront of this. Anything before we hop into chapter 8?
When God would come with a faulty bow, if you had an objective that you were trying to hit, if you had a faulty bow, whether you're looking at the option you're trying to hit or not, you don't know where the arrow's going to go.
Mm-hmm.
If you go anywhere, because the bow is not dependable.
Mm-hmm.
You can't aim the arrow with that bow, it's going to just shoot it off the side. It may shoot it right down on your throat. You don't know what it's going to do.
Mm-hmm.
So you wouldn't hunt with a bow that you know is faulty. And then it says the derision in the land of Egypt. God had taken them out of captivity. They were free. They're getting ready to go right back into captivity.
Mm-hmm. That's the image here. Captivity's coming back. See, exile is not the first exile, the exile of Israel. No, they were exiles to begin with. God found them in a state of exile called Egypt. And because they have not aimed true, that's where they'll return. Because it's a good idea to think of it, that faulty bow image. You can't aim true. But I don't think it's a bow for hunting. I think this is a bow for war. You're going to lose this because you haven't aimed for what is true. And you will go right back to where you came. Anything before we hop into chapter 8?
I thought of another bird reference that I think is relevant in the New Testament when Jesus was really kind of getting on the scribes and the Pharisees and all of that. In Matthew 23, when it says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing."
Mm-hmm. Speaking from experience, I have chickens at my house now. They're not very smart. And Christ, even there, talking about the scribes and Pharisees, the Jewish leaders religiously of that day, calls them a bunch of senseless birds, at least in my mind, with my experience with chickens. Yeah.
I don't think he's calling them unwise birds there. He's saying he was like a hen that would gather them under his wings. The hen will gather his chicks under his wings to protect it from the
Yeah. No, that's part of the, I think that's a big part of the image there too. Is that, Jeff?
The Egypt reference. There's so many symbols in the Bible, and it's very symmetrical. And so you've got this, like in each dispensation, there's a thing that happens that's similar. And when Jesus comes back to Israel from Egypt when he was a child, he's bringing them salvation out of Egypt. They were brought out of Egypt when they were created as a nation. They reject God, they get sent to Egypt as exiles, but then their salvation comes back to them from Egypt as a child after God is made man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. That's a good, New Testament kind of through line. Exodus, salvation out of Egypt. The sin happens, well, exile back to Egypt. Christ comes, he goes to Egypt and brings salvation back out of Egypt. See, it goes back to that cycle I threw back up at the beginning when we started this study a few weeks ago. The cycle doesn't change. God doesn't change.
Backtrack to the bow statement. You can have the truest shooting bow, but every year I hang it up in the closet after deer season. It sits there all year long through about September. I pull it back out. With this particular bow, no sights. I'm not shooting instinctively, which means I don't aim and I look hard if I want to hit. But if I'm not practicing, I can't hit a paper plate at 5 yards. The more I practice, at 20 yards, I can touch the arrow with no sights. It's kind of like the beginning of what you started with, even to the Word of God. If you put it on a counter, it collects dust. And we begin to miss the target. We begin to forget what it looked like, as we leave the beer. So we need to have a true shooting bow, but we constantly be practicing.
Yeah. Yeah. A tool you don't use grows dull. Whether it's literally growing dull itself or your use of it, your training with it has grown dull. If we aren't constantly using what God has given us, how are we ever expected to be effective with it? We'll be like a bow that doesn't aim true. Anything else on this before we hop into chapter 8? If not, can I get somebody to read 8 verses 1 through 3?
Set the trumpet to your mouth, he shall come like an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant, and rebelled against my laws. Israel will cry to me, my God, we know you. Israel has rejected the good, the enemy will pursue him.
It starts this, honestly, 3-chapter long. Chapters 8, 9, and 10 are all judgment. Pretty much. They're all just one thing after another. Look at what you've done. Look at this that's coming. This is a problem. And here we see, the start of it, the core of it, really, in these first 3 verses. First, the covenant's been broken, right? You don't know me. You don't listen to my law. You've broken the covenant. The second thing, they cry out to God. They say, God, we know you. And then the third thing, they've rejected good. So and the first thing you've done is broken the covenant, broken the law, and you've rejected good at the end. In the middle, do you truly know God? No. Because if you knew God, you wouldn't have rejected the covenant in the beginning, and you wouldn't reject what is good in the end. It's broken. The covenant is shattered. The law is shattered. The people themselves will now then be broken. Anything on that before we move a little further into chapter 8? If not, can I get somebody to read verses 4 through 6? So, God makes it clear what they turned to, what this rejection of good made them turn to. It's made them turn to two things: kings and idols. Kings and idols, which in the ancient world went hand in hand. Let's take back to the Egypt image. What is Pharaoh? He's God on earth as king. That's how Egypt's viewed their pharaohs for a long time. And look what Israel's becoming. They're becoming Egypt. And it started with the division. See, they first relied on these earthly kings, right? And particularly ones not appointed by God. I referenced it a few weeks ago when I did the Wednesday night talk, but when you look at like the anointing of David and Solomon, there's a couple things to take note of. Or not David and Solomon, I meant Saul, but that's who I was thinking of when I said Solomon. They're all the same role. When God gets Samuel to anoint Saul, God says to do it. And the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Saul. And the same thing happens with David. God says do it, and that happens. Because God chose them. But you get later on in Israel's history, and what do you not see anymore? Well, these men are just putting themselves in these roles. They're choosing their own leaders, not letting God. They told God, shove off. We got this. We know who's good for the job. It wasn't you, so we picked kings. Then you helped us pick kings, but we'd rather pick our own kings. Much like Egypt. And when the kingdom splits, you got Israel in the north, Judah in the south. What's the first thing the northern kingdom does under their new leadership? Yeah, they established idolatry. They put a calf in the north, a calf in the south, specifically to do what? What's the motivation? So they won't go back to Jerusalem. Because what's in Jerusalem? The temple where they worship. See, idolatry is the same root problem. I said it last week and I'll say it again. Idolatry is ultimately man's worship of self. Because even here, this idolatry that's referenced, it wasn't done out of some reverence for these calves. It was done to keep political power. It was done to keep people in the north where the king of the time could control them. Where he wouldn't lose his people to Jerusalem and to the south. It wasn't about the idols. It was about him. Because idolatry is just self-worship. It's just justified self-worship. And God makes it pretty clear. These craftsman-made images are going to be smashed and broken to pieces. Anything on verses 4 through 6?
A while ago, I think you mentioned about how the Egyptians chose their king.
Mm-hmm.
I believe if you were Egyptologist, you had to go back and look at Egyptian mythology, especially how they chose their kings when they worshiped gods like Osiris, Isis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they literally thought like, well, Pharaoh's God on earth. Pharaoh is, representation of God on earth. He is all but God, if not God. And Israel wanted that. And they're receiving it. In all of its awful, awful destruction. This brings us to 7 through 10. Can somebody read those for me? Yeah. This image of the seed being thrown into the wind is this image of withering. Think about it. You just throw seed out there. Is it going to grow? Yeah, some of it might, right? It's probably going to wither, though, because it's not necessarily in the best spot. And God says, your numbers are literally going to dwindle and wither. Because you've gone to these false lovers, you've done all these things, you've turned to Assyria, and you're going to wither. Your numbers, the amount of people you have, is going to dwindle. Now, I think this ties back to the Egypt image as well, because the event that starts off the Exodus narrative, what is it? Yes, Pharaoh is going to kill the firstborn. He wants them gone. He's going to wither the Jewish nation's numbers, because he didn't want them to rise up against him, because they were getting too numerous. He had a population problem, and to fix the problem, he was going to wither out their numbers. And God says, look, you wanted Egypt. You wanted Assyria. You will bear that consequence again. You will begin to decrease in numbers under the burden of kings and leaders. You're going to be swallowed up, broken up, discarded like pottery because of your choice. From Egypt, which I delivered you, to Egypt you will return. This brings us to 11 through 14. Can somebody read those for me?
Because Ephraim has made many altars for sin, they have become for him altars for sinning. I have written for him the great things of my law, they will consider a strange thing. For the sacrifices of my offerings they sacrifice flesh and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity, punish their sins, they shall return to Egypt. For Israel has forgotten his maker, and has built up temples. Judah also has multiplied fortified cities. But I will send fire upon these cities, and it shall devour his house.
We see here Ephraim, Israel, has built up all these altars for sin to sin all the more. And God literally says, I could write you point by point by point by point, thousands and thousands of instructions, and at this point you wouldn't even get it. You wouldn't even understand. And God's not going to accept your strange and odd sacrifices. They eat the flesh. And God just does not accept them. He's going to remember their guilt and punish their sins. And they will return to Egypt. It's an Exodus reversal. And it's ultimately the story of Israel's kingship. To finish off, when God allows them to have a king and he warns them what that king will become, go read that. And then go read Exodus and read Pharaoh. And read the kings. The kings became Pharaoh. And that, I think, is all the time we have. Let's